So if you put yourself in the shoes of the administrator or the politician who is charged with the task in contemporary societies to develop prostitution policy, let's say at a local level, or it could even be at the national level, but then what we argue is that such administrators or politicians are facing a number of serious challenges that make the development of prostitution policy very difficult. So I'll just mention them and then I'll tell you a little bit about each one of them. First is the enduring stigma on prostitution. The second one is that, as I already mentioned, prostitution is an example par excellence of morality politics. The third challenge is that there are very, very few accurate and reliable data available on prostitution. The fourth challenge is that prostitution policy is almost always local politics, local policy. So the implementation of prostitution policy is what counts. No matter how idealistic or grandiose your policy ideas, you have to be able to put it into effect, otherwise it doesn't work. Many sex workers in almost all countries are migrants. That can be migrants from another country, foreign migrants. So for example, the two countries that we studied in depth, Austria and the Netherlands, most of the migrants were from Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Moldavia, Poland, Hungary. But in olden days and in many countries in the Southern Hemisphere, it's internal migration from the rural areas into the city. And that all those challenges have a huge impact on how to develop, how to formulate and how to implement, how to put into effect prostitution policies. So let's start with stigma. As far as I can see from our readings, stigma again has been of all times and all places. Maybe there are small pockets where there was no stigma on prostitution, but almost everywhere else there is. And I won't go into the reasons for that. There's philosophers who have done that, but I will go into the effects of stigma. So what stigma does is, first of all, in many people it leads to a strong emotional reaction when they talk about prostitution. It's a reaction of anger. It's a reaction of disgust. How can a woman sell her body? You know, you have heard many politicians talk about that, or ordinary people. How can you sell your body to a stranger, a disgusting man? And those emotions are so strong that it usually ends the conversation. The second effect of stigma is a kind of fear of contagion. And that in the 19th century was actually quite real, because sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, which was uncurable in those days, and gonorrhea, they spread like wildfire. So there was a real risk, and there's whole theories that the state came into the business of prostitution policy because they wanted to protect their recruits, their armies. But nowadays it's not so much, except of course for the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, it's not so much anymore the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, but a kind of moral contagion. So certain radical feminists have the opinion that if only one man has sex with a sex worker, it affects the dignity of all women. But in policy terms, the contagion is seen as very realistic. So, for example, when the Netherlands repealed the Brothel Act, the Christian democratic parties, or the Christian parties I should say, had a strong fear that it would attract thousands and thousands of migrants from Eastern European countries who wanted to work here, because now it was legal, right? I mean, brothels were legal. So that fear of contagion has then a third effect, namely control. So you want to control prostitution. And again, there's lots written about it, and I don't want to go into great detail. Many thinkers argue that it's not so much control of prostitution, but control of female sexuality that is at stake. But whichever way you think about it, stigma always, as it sticks in your throat like a fishbone. You can't get away from it. And one of my colleagues, Leslie Jeffries, has the simple but brilliant insight that even in countries that have decriminalized prostitution, the stigma hasn't gone away. We still look at prostitution and at sex workers with great distrust, if not revulsion. So that's a very important thing to realize if you are a politician or an administrator or a civil servant developing prostitution policy. And it's a funny thing. I mean, I've spoken, and then I stop about this, with ordinary people who say, no, of course, every society has prostitution, it should be allowed. But the moment it becomes personal, they are completely against it. That's when the emotion kicks in.